Welcome to the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Dame, holistic nutrition coach and speaker. Let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode here on the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. I am so excited to introduce you to today's guest. Martha Carlin is here with us. Welcome to the show, Marlon.
Thank you so much for having me today, Danny.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I'm so excited to have this conversation today because we haven't had a lot of the important gut health conversations on the show. And I think we all hopefully by now know the importance, but we're going to dive into that. And for those who don't know who you are, I'm just going to introduce you briefly here. Martha Carlin is a transformational leader who has leveraged her extensive business experience as a turnaround expert to become a leading citizen scientist in the field of the microbiome. With a focus on improving human health, Carlin founded the Bio Collective, a company dedicated to studying the microbiome and its impact on human health. And through the Bio Collective, she has conducted groundbreaking research on the gut microbiome and its relationship to diseases such as Parkinson's disease. Carlin also launched the BioTQuest brand of targeted probiotics, which offers targeted probiotics to restore the lost microbiome function and balance. Her innovative approach has earned recognition from the National Institutes of Health and the White House Microbiome Initiative, making her a key figure in the field of microbiome research. So if we want to have a conversation about microbiome, it's obviously with you, Martha.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Okay, so I mean, I know you have quite the story, so this may be hard to kind of sum up, but I love starting these episodes with our guests with a little bit of your backstory. You know, what is it that got you into your fascination with microbiome and the health, and, you know, how did that journey really start and then evolve for you?
Sure. So it actually started about 21 years ago when my 44-year-old husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's. He was a young, healthy dad. You know, we had two small children, 2 and 4, and he was a marathon runner. And I'm looking and just wondering, how does this healthy person who's never done, quote, anything wrong, end up with Parkinson's disease, an old person's disease? And my background and training, coming out of college, I was trained by a company in something called transaction flow review, which is how you look at a business and you draw flow charts of everything that's flowing through the business to understand where the breakpoints could be. And so I looked at how science and medicine was, very reductionist, and here's a pill, there's nothing we can do. And I said, well, I think this is a systems problem. Let's, map the flow through the system. And of course, where do you start with that? You start with food. And so I started to study food and really look at what he had been eating and what we had been eating in our household, and really turned that around. Although back in 2002, that was hard to do. There was not a lot of organic food. And so then I started to study, well, what's in the food? If I can't get organic food, what's in our food? How's it grown? And that knowledge just expanded over the years. And then in 2014, I read a book called Missing Microbes by Dr. Martin Blaser, who was talking about the rise in chronic diseases in the United States since we had discovered antibiotics, and they were handed out like candy, and they're used in all of the agricultural practices, and that was destroying this thing called the microbiome, which I had never heard of. And I was like, that's it. And then about 6 months later, a scientist in Finland showed that he could take there's two primary types of Parkinson's, and he could actually separate the people with one or the other by the bacteria in their gut. And I was like, okay, I'm quitting my job. I started to fund research at the University of Chicago, looking at my husband's gut and my gut together. And then from that, actually became friends with the scientists there and founded the Bio Collective with another scientist, Dr. Suzanne Vernon, because we we saw that there were common elements across what we classify as single diseases, and those common elements are in the microbiome. And so we wanted to build a biobank and data so that we could start to look and say, okay, what are these common things across the population that are driving these different diseases? And
Yeah.
so that's
Wow.
how the BioCollective was born. And then from that data, we went on to learn and say, okay, how can we start to restore certain functions or clean up certain messes that we've made in our gut and, bring back the good guys?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. What a journey you've been on. First of all, I can't even imagine, what that diagnosis and that journey has been like for you and your family. And, I have a billion questions that I want to ask about how he's doing and what you've learned and all that. And we're going to get to that. But I think a great sort of baseline place now is just to quickly define what is the microbiome. Hopefully, a lot of my listeners are already familiar with gut health and how that affects, of course, our challenges with health and sugar. But for those who don't, it's always great to have a new little definition here. So what is a microbiome?
Well, 10 years ago when I started the BioCollective, not very many people knew what it was. It is definitely more prevalent in the media, and people know a lot about it, or some about it. But it's the trillions of microbes that live in and on our body, and they really function as our internal pharmacy to maintain our health. So they make vitamins, hormones, neurotransmitters. Many of the things in our body cannot function properly. We can't digest food properly if we don't have a healthy microbiome. So we need some happy microbes, and we need to think about them in the context, because we're actually more microbial than we are human. In terms of cells, there's about a 2-to-1 ratio of microbial cells to human cells in the body. And so a lot of the genetic function that we have actually comes from the microbes in the body.
Wow. That is fascinating. That is so fascinating. And yeah, really, really interesting. We start understanding, right? We're made up of these like fungus or these bacterias or these microbiomes. I mean, there's lots of obviously way out of my reach of the science of it all, but yeah, that's really fascinating. I love your definition of the pharmacy being the pharmacy of the body. I often think of even soil, and I love to garden. So like the soil, we know that it has like, we need some worms in there. We need some like all the little like bacterias and the things in there that help break down the soil, help keep it healthy. And it's very interesting I mean, maybe we can talk about this later, but this is where my mind goes, right? We live in this world now, especially over the last few years, that has become germophobic, right? And I even see this within my family. I have a couple of family members who are just obsessed with like always using hand sanitizer, always like their house is perfectly clean. And I'm the one that eats food off the floor still. I'll fully admit that. I'm like, I want the bacteria and I want to eat some dirt on my carrots that I grew myself. And anyway, so that's kind of probably for another minute. But before we go into that, maybe you can speak a little bit to like the gut brain axis. Like we've heard a lot about this. I think, I've heard a lot about this. I know that there's been books about this, right? But and maybe even specifically speaking to the sugar component here, right? How does sugar actually impact our gut? How does sugar actually impact the microbiome and the messages and the feedback loop that happen there?
So it's great you mentioned feedback loop. It is a feedback loop. We have something called the vagus nerve that travels from the gut to the brain, and we're constantly getting signals. I mean, we grow up knowing gut instinct. I mean, there are chemical signals. So when I say the microbiome is the internal pharmacy and it makes hormones or it activates hormones, you can activate stress hormones or produce. So bacteria in your gut can produce all these different molecules. So you can, if you're eating a lot of sugar, you're feeding a certain profile of bacteria, and those bacteria produce molecules that can increase that level of stress. It can increase. So, one thing that we look at in terms of sugar is sugar feeds gram-negative bacteria, kind of preferentially. And gram-negative bacteria are the bacteria that produce endotoxin. And endotoxin at a high level can actually kill you. Low-level endotoxin, there's recent research showing that they can actually cause depression in about 2 hours by giving someone endotoxin. So this loop of what's going on is, you're producing metabolites, or the endotoxin, which is the cell wall of those bacteria, that's communicating with the brain. Then the brain is going, okay, I'm stressed, or depressed, and that creates chemicals, and you just get this continuous feedback loop. And then, of course, if you try to stop eating sugar, those bacteria will send out signals to make you crave the sugar. So you have to get past that period, actually, where there's a die-off of those organisms from getting rid of the sugar, or they'll keep sending you those signals as they sort of rise and fall in their growth cycle. So it can be a pretty vicious cycle, if you're eating sugar.
Yeah. Well, I think everybody who's listening to this podcast, has some sort of challenges, a relationship with sugar. And I really appreciate you explaining that, because I know some of my listeners and myself, right, we've heard that, that sugar feeds the bad gut bacteria, right? That's often what we might hear. But it's really interesting what you're mentioning there too, is like this vicious cycle, even just with the example of stress, is I know many of my listeners will eat sugar because they're feeling stressed. And then that sugar in the gut is going to lead to more of a response of stress. And in the moment, it might feel like a sense of peace or calm. Like I know a lot of my clients will, have their hit of sugar and then feel good for like an hour and then start feeling like crap again, right? And you mentioned this, like it can lead to the sugar crash, right? Of the depression, increases in anxiety, increases of like a stress response of cortisol levels in the body. So yeah, really, really fascinating to see how that like just feeds in on each other, right? And how it can seem challenging. Then how do I interrupt that pattern or that loop, right? But as you mentioned, like there's a little bit of a period where we need to commit to that to kill off some of that bacteria. So yeah, that's fascinating. You mentioned a bit earlier, and I'm curious about this in the research that you've done. You know, is it the chicken or the egg, right? Like the question here being, can the microbiome itself like lead to the development of disease? Like I know you've studied Parkinson's a lot. Or is it like the disease that then leads to an imbalance in the microbiome? Like how do you prove which way it is coming in from?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of ongoing research on that. I think, looking at Dr. Blazer's work on disrupting the microbiome and how that drives disease, and many of the researchers who are actually looking all the way back to when we're born, our method of birth, and if you're born via cesarean versus a vaginal birth, you will not get colonized by the microbes that we have historically been colonized. And also, just eating the Western diet, moms no longer have some of the microbes that they used to colonize babies with. There's a very important Bifido infantis strain of bacteria that globally indigenous babies still have, but babies in Western cultures don't have it. And it's there's actually a company that makes it now called it Vivo to restore it. It's fed exclusively by breast milk, and that is a organism that trains the immune system. So it's in that early process, it forms basically it's the only primary organism in the baby's GI tract. It trains the immune system to deal with all these other organisms. So, my opinion is that the loss of diversity and the issues that we have with our microbiome is one of the it may not be the only, but it is one of the primary drivers of disease. And I think about that in context of not only our microbiome, but the microbiome of the soil, because our food is very much depleted, just like we're depleted, because the soil microbiome is also suffering from all the chemicals and antibiotic things that we've done to the soil. And in a plant, that microbiome is what helps it take up the minerals and make the plant nutritious. And then an animal eats it and gets its nutrition. And then, we go up that food chain. And so I think that the microbes and the way we've kind of decimated it across the planet is a primary driver of what's going on with disease.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a powerful statement. And I'm not going to argue with you on that. I can definitely see, how that's a big player. Right? We see as we become more and more, depleted, like you said, or more and more germophobic, as I said earlier, we're also just getting sicker and sicker, right? And these superbugs are developing, and there's more, like there's a whole bunch of stuff, right? There's a whole lot of conversations we can have about that. But so
there's something called the hygiene hypothesis, actually, that talks about in Western cultures this, we're not outside in the soil like we used to be. We're not in contact with animals like we used to be. And people are germaphobes. And so they're constantly washing, actually using sanitizers. Using water is one thing, but these, very chemical sanitizers. And that has actually caused our immune systems not to be well trained. And so we grow up, with this hypersensitivity because we haven't trained our immune system properly, because we're so hyper hygienic.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. That's why I try to spend as much time barefoot outside as I can. But yeah, that's really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. There's obviously a lot here, right? And a lot to consider and a lot of pieces, for everybody. So I think it's pretty clear now. We've chatted, and I appreciate, you've really shared some powerful insights. And I think my audience now might be curious about, well, what do we do about this, right? If we notice that we're depleted, we notice that, we're having maybe even some digestion and bowel movement issues. We can tell that there may be things going on there. So I guess, first of all, how do we know if our microbiome is maybe not in a healthy place? Like, how do we know if we're depleted?
Well, so I would say kind of two primary ways that you will know, and one was actually proven out by a large scale European study, is something called the Bristol stool scale, or your bowel movements. Are you actually having a bowel movement every day, at least once a day? Probably better more than twice a day. If you have a pet, they go to the bathroom pretty much right after you feed them. So you're putting food in, the waste is going out. And this was something I learned a lot more about in looking at Parkinson's and Parkinson's samples, because people with Parkinson's suffer from chronic constipation for about 80% of them for 10 to 15 years prior to ever being diagnosed with Parkinson's. So if you just think about, like, if you're not eliminating the waste on a daily basis, then you have microbial toxins sitting in your body, and your immune system's having to deal with those. And so, that's probably a number one signal. Another is bloating and gas, particularly with certain kinds of foods, and a sign of something called SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I'm friends with Dr. William Davis, who wrote the Wheat Belly and more recently the Super Gut book. And he's estimating that probably 50% of the people in the United States have SIBO, and that's where the microbes from the colon that are supposed to be only in the colon actually migrate up into the small intestine, the small bowel, and they're stealing our nutrients. They're producing hydrogen gas, methane gas, and that's often when you'll feel a lot of rumbling and just problems when you eat, and often craving of sugar. So you can have SIBO or SIFO, which is a fungal overgrowth, which is often candida, and that's a real sugar monster.
Yes. Yeah. I think we've heard of that one before, I believe. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So what are some things then, like around testing? Like, like if I was having some troubles with my stool or bloating and gas, like you mentioned, how would I go and actually test what's going on and know definitively, right? Because I know a lot of my clients, a lot of listeners here aren't really that in tune with their body quite yet. And sometimes that can be tricky to know what's going on, right? And testing can be really, really helpful. So what do you recommend, or do you recommend testing, and what do we look for in those
Well,
tests?
I would say, so when we started our company 10 years ago, we actually uh, did genomic sequencing and provided a report with information, and we had a tremendous amount of information, like so much information. And physicians aren't really trained in the microbiome. I mean, functional medicine doctors have had training, and they understand to some degree, but the research is expanding so rapidly. um, it's difficult, and you can't, except in the case of something like Fusobacteria nucleatum, which is an oral microbe that gets in the colon that has been definitively shown to be a cause of colon cancer. When you're looking at those reports, you can get a sense of, okay, I'm out of balance. I've got a problem here. But most of the time, they don't give you anything actionable to do about it. And Dr. Davis it's not his, but he talks about this little air device that's made by a company called Food Marble. And that actually can diagnose to some extent SIBO, because you eat, and then a certain period after you eat, you blow into it. And if you're making the hydrogen gas or the methane gas, it's an indication that you have SIBO.
Right.
And that's something specifically, then you can follow a SIBO protocol.
Yeah.
In a microbiome sample, you're taking it from the stool, which is from your colon. And if you have SIBO, that's from your small bowel. So you're not really getting a sample from where the problem may be. But, I will say, Microbiome Labs has a test. Nirvana Biome has a test you can just order yourself. Or if you have a functional medicine doctor, Genova Diagnostics has a GI map, I think is what it's called. And I think Doctor's Data also has a kit. And those are testing more for specific pathogens. And they will give you, if they identify, say, the GI map test, they may identify certain pathogens, and they'll give you what either antibiotics or herbals that it is susceptible to, so that you could do something to address those. So, I would say, working with a practitioner who has knowledge in the microbiome, if you want to use testing. Otherwise, I just tell people, you need to learn about what it takes to have a healthy gut and how to fix the terrain in your body. And getting rid of sugar is, number one on the list. Sugar, wheat, grains, those are very high on the list of protecting your microbiome, not just from the sugar, but also from the chemicals that are on the grains that are grown. So glyphosate, which is used on a lot of those products, is an antibiotic and will kill the good bacteria and leave the bad bacteria to flourish.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah. And I also really appreciate that. Like, if anyone's listening to this going, I want to do a test, a microbiome test, to work with somebody who can help you analyze that. Cause I can see, I know there are so many amazing companies, and thank you for mentioning a few, that you can do these order away tests, right? And do the stool test and send it away, and you get these results. And then what do you do with it? Like, how do you know how to interpret it? Because I am not a sciencey person. Like, I would be so overwhelmed and so confused. I'm like, what does this even mean? What are all these bacteria names? Like, should I be concerned? So I think that's a really powerful message. So work with someone, either a naturopath or a functional medical doctor, and like start investigating some of that if you are having some symptoms. So what can we do then? You just mentioned a couple things, right? Obviously getting rid of grains and gluten and sugar. What are some of the other key factors that you see in really promoting a healthy gut microbiome?
Well, I mean, diet is really number one. And, I mentioned glyphosate. That is one of my primary focuses, because those chemicals that are, and also the preservatives in the food. So getting rid of convenience foods, even things that you think are healthy, the prepackaged foods. I tell people, my husband used to love hummus. It comes in the tub. They love it. Well, that's a petri dish for bacteria. So they put anti-enzymatic things on top of it so it won't grow bacteria. But of course, then you're eating those anti-enzymatic things, and enzymes are what digest your food. So, I tell people that just focus on good quality, whole foods, whole real foods, cooking at home, eating vegetables that are not high in sugar or with a high glycemic index, not in fruits, but fruit on a limited basis, because it does have a lot of fructose. And I think the modification of the plants and the way we're growing them now has changed the sugar profiles in the fruits as well. And I mean, I eat toward a paleo keto type of diet, but I do eat a lot of vegetables and a very limited set of fruits. But you've got to be feeding the microbes some type of fiber, because
Okay.
that's what they eat. So they eat what you're not eating. So you want to be getting fiber in your food. I mean, you can take a fiber supplement, but it's really better to get the fiber in your whole foods if you can. And I often recommend, so I use the Whole30 cookbook, or Weston Price Nourishing Traditions, which has a lot of traditional food recipes. I do a lot of fermented foods, because those will help feed your microbes. And there's a cookbook called You Can Heal Your Gut, which has kind of a step-by-step approach, which is really nice if you're a little bit challenged. And the recipes in those are not difficult. And then I think there's also the Microbiome cookbook, and that's just a little paperback, and it has some great simple recipes to help your gut.
Nice. Amazing. So many beautiful resources out there, right? To start helping us eat better. And this is a message that I know my audience has heard from me in many different ways, right? It's all about whole, real foods, and lowering, those toxic chemicals and the preservatives and the additives and all the crap that they're trying to put in us, and not only affecting our gut microbiome, but just every cell in our body, right? Being so affected, especially over the long run with these things. So, okay, let's talk about probiotics, because this is something when people think about gut health and microbiome, they're like, well, I'll just take a probiotic supplement and all my problems will be gone. What do you say to those sorts of comments? And, and where can probiotics work into helping support us in healing our gut?
Sure. Well, probiotics can be a great way to help reinforce or support your gut. But what I do tell people, if you go to the store, you go to Amazon, you're looking at this shelf and your eyes are crossing because there's hundreds of different brands there. Well, probiotics generally are coming the ingredients that go in those, so the bacteria that go in those, are generally coming from just three large scale suppliers. Globally, most of the strains are produced by Danesco, which is affiliated with DuPont, Christian Hansen that just sold to Novozymes, and Probi, which is a Swedish company. There are some smaller fermentation companies and some in Italy, but those are the three big producers. And so most of those probiotics that you're buying on the shelf, there are about a dozen commercially widely available strains. And so any bottle you pick up is going to be pretty simply interchangeable. And this was a problem that we saw in our data, and working with my chief scientific officer is Dr. Raul Cano. He's a world-renowned microbiologist, was one of the first people to sequence a lactobacillus genome, which lactobacillus is one of the main species of probiotics, lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. And now there's a class of what are called spore-forming bacteria, and that would be a product like Megaspore that would have those organisms. And so we started looking at it and saying, okay, well, microbes work together for one, so you don't want to just throw whatever into the bottle that you can get for the cheapest price. You want to build a team of microbes that works together to restore the function or do the job that you're looking for. And so initially, I actually went to a Parkinson's meeting, and they were presenting some data about the sugar alcohol mannitol, it's a sugar substitute. But mannitol could actually stop the aggregation of the proteins that were causing Parkinson's and pull it out of the brain. And so I came back from the meeting, bought a mannitol chemistry book, and started reading about it. And there was just a handful of probiotic organisms that make mannitol, and they make it from glucose and fructose. And I also knew people with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's are sometimes called type 3 diabetes, where it's insulin resistance of the brain. And so I was like, okay, well, if we can build a team of microbes that includes these organisms that can convert glucose and fructose to mannitol, then you will just basically pee it out, because humans don't use mannitol, but microbes do. And so we first prototyped a product just for my husband to try, because at the time he was struggling a bit, walking with a cane, having trouble navigating through a crowd. And so, we prototyped our formula, gave it to him, and we're measuring his microbiome along the way. And within 30 days, he was no longer walking with a cane. His microbiome had moved back in the direction of what is in the Human Microbiome Project defined as the healthy microbiome. And we kept tracking him for 120 days and could see that it was continuing to improve over time, taking the product. And so it actually was a couple of years later, we decided to pivot, and we used our computational model that put together that formula to build a whole suite of formulas to do different things for people. But the one, that's nearest and dearest to my heart, we call it Sugar Shift, because it changes sugar metabolism in the body. And we ended up doing a clinical trial in diabetes and showing, that it is altering the microbiome back to a healthier state. And in that process is, changing the whole profile. It's lowering, removing that endotoxin, the LPS I mentioned before. It's reducing the blood sugar and insulin and HOMA-IR and a number of the different markers and over a longer period of time is even lowering HbA1c.
Wow. Okay. This is really cool and very exciting what you're creating. Thank you for sharing the backstory to that. And so let me see if I get this correct. Obviously what's it called? Sugar FX?
Sugar Shift.
Sorry. So amazing. Cause what you're saying is the certain strains of probiotic or bacteria in there uses sugar and fructose that might be coming in dietarily. We might be eating a banana. It actually feeds off of that, converts it into mannitol so it can be easily just peed out, flushed out, and gone from the body. So it's kind of this extra liver or like filtration system. I don't know, that just came to me. Filtering out some of those toxins, and that obviously the high doses of sugar that many people are taking, and actually helping promote good gut bacteria growth instead of feeding the sugar to maybe the not so good bacteria. Is that right?
That is right. And then also kind of back to my glyphosate passion. So I knew we had so much glyphosate, and glyphosate was killing lactobacillus. And so 4 of the strains that are in here are actually our proprietary strains. And one of those is a strain of Lactobacillus plantarum that we isolated from fermented elderberries that came off, from walking on a trail in Colorado. And it was resistant to glyphosate. And we looked at it, and it had the capability to actually break glyphosate down without producing this toxic chemical called AMPA. And so all of our products contain that Lactobacillus plantarum, because we also want to help people detoxify from glyphosate. And then lactobacillus have some pretty amazing properties in terms of helping with the removal of heavy metals through the feces, and
Wow.
just overall improved
Wow.
health.
Yeah. Wow. This is amazing. So amazing, Martha, because I know a lot of my listeners and my old self would have also thought, well, the liver is the only part of my body that cleanses things, right? Like the liver is in charge of everything. But what I hear you sharing here is that we can actually engage like certain strains of microbiome to support us in the detoxification, right, of the toxic world that we live in. Is that right?
Sure, that is right. And I think that is also why some of the spore forming bacteria, so the microbiome labs, that makes megaspore, I think. Well, actually, it's owned by Novozymes now, but that is 3 or 4 spore forming bacteria. And those are organisms that are very good at breaking down what are known as xenobiotics, these toxins and chemicals. And we have one spore forming bacteria in our formula, also a Bacillus subtilis, that also has some of those capabilities as well.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So you mentioned you have a few products, and I know you're showing us a one here, but what are some of the other like targeted problems that you help people with? What are some of the other products that you have that, and I guess what can it help people with, just so my listeners
Sure.
can know?
Well, sleep was a big one that a lot of
Yeah.
our customers had talked about. So we have a product for sleep. It's called Simple Slumber, and it bacteria can produce melatonin just like we do in our cells. So it produces bacterial melatonin and tryptophan. It has a little bit of tryptophan in it, but the microbes expand that production of tryptophan and melatonin. Works for about 7 hours, and you wake up and you're not groggy. And but you can't take that product if you are on an antidepressant or an MAO inhibitor, because it does have tryptophan and the microbes are making tryptophan. Another product that we brought out, actually was the last, I think, product that we brought out, was one called antibiotic antidote. And we have about 25 formulas that we've run through our model and prototyped, but we haven't brought them all to market. But this one was designed specifically for taking after you've taken antibiotics, to help restore the system so that you can get a broader diversity to come back. Because a lot of, if you just like go to the store and buy a lactobacillus, 1 or 2 strains or something, it's going to make your gut too acidic, and you won't be able to get a kind of a full complement. So that product we brought to market because a friend of mine's mother actually was in her 80s. She had appendicitis, had her appendix out, got septic, was on IV antibiotics for a month, and her gut was just a mess. And she went to the doctor, and they were like, oh, they just didn't think it was a big deal that she wasn't
Yeah.
regular.
Ugh.
And So he called me and he said, I know you have this on your list. Could you make it? And so we made a small batch so that she could have some, and it sold out so quickly. We're like, okay, we're going to bring that to market. And then we have a product called Ideal Immunity. It's very good against food poisoning. So it has a strain of bacteria that is very effective against Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli and the foodborne pathogens, and just kind of strengthens the immune system overall. And then we have one called Heart Centered that helps with nitric oxide production and CoQ10 production in the gut. So
Yeah.
bacteria can make just about anything you want. You just have to look for bacteria that have the capability in their genome, and voila, you put them together in a team, and it's like you have a little factory in your gut.
Yeah, your own little pharmacy. I think you said that earlier, and I really loved that. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Those all sound like really important. I can think of people that I know who need help with their sleep and who have just been on antibiotics recently and need to get on a good probiotic. And I think what you're doing is just so amazing and so needed in the world to really, help bring awareness, not just to like what we're putting in our body, but into like how we're supporting this life-giving microbiome that really rules everything, right? It's constantly, it's kind of like behind the scenes pulling all the levers, right? In our body and in our
Right,
health.
right. Yes, it
Yeah.
is.
Okay, so this is fantastic. So I'm sure the question on everybody's mind now, as we sort of wrap things up, is how's your husband doing? I'd love to hear, like, maybe if you're open to sharing some of the specific changes that you've made in diet, lifestyle, like anything, and then also with using some of these amazing products. How's he doing, and what have you noticed in the progression or regression of his disease?
Sure. Well, over the years, there have been ups and downs.
Of course.
One of the hardest things for him to do was to get off of sugar. It took him, even with me, making the probiotic and, cooking healthy and all of that, it still took him about 3 years to fully kick sugar. And, it's not a small task. And I see that very often in people with Parkinson's, that they have a sweet tooth and they really struggle to get off of sugar. And so that was probably the toughest thing. So he took the probiotic, and there's a score that scores how advanced your Parkinson's is. And at the peak score before he took the probiotic, his score was a 35. The higher the score, the more progressed your disease is. And his score dropped down to a 20 after a year on the probiotic.
Wow.
And it stayed at a 20 for 4 years until he had COVID at the end of 2021. And he had a pretty severe setback. And most of the symptoms you hear from people with, brain fog, or he had orthostatic hypotension. So POTS, or, if he would stand up, his blood pressure would drop and he would get faint. Just fatigue, lots of different issues. And we spent a year really working hard to get that back in shape. And one of my customers actually wrote me because she started making yogurt based on Dr. Davis's SIBO yogurt protocol for one of her neighbors who developed Parkinson's symptoms after having COVID.
Wow.
And so she was making a really high count. So she would start with like 10 capsules and ferment it for 36 hours. So she probably had 8 billion CFUs, where, this is 18. And within a month, his system, all the symptoms kind of went away. So I started doing that with John, and he started improving more and more. So we're now 2 years out from that. He's much, much better, but he's still not back to where he was before he had COVID. And I've been looking at a lot of the research papers on the mechanisms of the spike protein and how that, where that goes in the body, and how that affects, different, if you have a disease already or may cause a different disease, whether that's from having COVID itself or having a COVID vaccine. It's the spike protein that is, potentially driving this inflammation. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. That's a whole nother podcast we need to have you back
yeah,
on for. Because yes, I have a lot to say about that too, but we're running out of time for that.
yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that honesty of the ups and downs. And I'm sorry that you've had that setback. I know many have been affected, with COVID, and it's seems like you're using this as a chance to learn a lot as well, learn more about what's going on in his body, and yeah, just so wishing you all the best with this journey, and how beautiful that you have these tools, right? These beautiful microbiomes, these other tools that I know you have to really support him, and support all the other humans in the world that you're supporting. So thank you for doing what you do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as we wrap things up here, is there anything else that you feel called to share? Is there anything we didn't get to cover today, or any final messages that you want to share with the audience?
Well, I mean, we touched on sugar. Sugar is the basis of, what you're talking to people about. And sugar is really how we kind of came into the market through another coach who coaches people on how to get off sugar. And I think that, people do not really realize how much sugar is a driver of inflammation, and all these different diseases go back to inflammation. And like I said at the beginning, that endotoxin, there are all these animal models where they're studying and they use endotoxin to, cause Parkinson's, cause Alzheimer's, cause, diabetes, connect the dots. It's sugar is the place to start making those changes and making that commitment, because you're going to just feel so much better once you do. I mean, it might be tough getting there, but once you get over that hump, you're just going to feel so much better.
Yeah, it's life-changing, for sure. And I know a lot of my listeners have been on that path, and know how life-changing it is, in all areas to get back in control of their sugar levels and that sugar dragon. So yeah, thank you for that final message, Martha. This has been incredible. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much. And I know we actually didn't mention this, but you and I were talking before this episode about providing a special code for any of my listeners who would like to try some of your amazing products. So thank you for that, Martha. I'll make sure there's a link below in the show notes for everybody listening. Martha is offering an amazing code, and offer for all of you who want to dive in and get some good quality probiotics that are going to help turn sugar into garbage that gets released from the body. Yeah, I really appreciate that, Martha. So where can everybody, I mean, obviously I'm going to have some links below this episode, but where can everybody come and find out more about everything that you're up to? I know you've got a couple endeavors on the go, and if anyone listening wants to learn more about what you're up to and what you're doing, where can they find you?
So they can find the probiotics on Biotic Quest. It's kind of a mouthful. It's BIOTIQUEST.com. I think like biotic is life, and quest, we're all out for the life quest. And then if you're interested in my Parkinson's work, I have a blog called Martha's Quest. And so you can find out information about there. And then if you're really interested in the history of collecting poop samples and the data and all the things that went into the science that got us to the product, we have a website, thebiocollective.com, and that is our kind of science-based research company.
Amazing. Thank you for making all those resources available. I'll make sure they're linked below in the show notes for anybody who wants to go and check out everything Martha is up to. Thank you again, Martha, for being here. This was so informative, and I know my audience got a lot out of this and is hopefully feeling re-inspired to look after that gut microbiome and stop using so much hand sanitizer. I had to say it. All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning into another episode, and we will see you on the next one. Thank you for tuning into another episode. If you're loving what we talked about today, please remember to subscribe, leave a review and share this episode with someone you love. And if you're ready to dive deeper into discovering your root causes and patterns that are keeping you hooked on sugar, be sure to check out our brand new free workshop series that will help you kick emotional eating for good. Find the link to download this free series and other amazing resources in the show notes below.